when I first heard Lenny, which would be about 1975, there was almost nothing known about the guy unless you lived in Winnipeg or Toronto. And there were, I think, one or two magazine articles about Lenny in Guitar Player magazine, and that gave a little bit of an outline to his life, but not much. So there was very little documented about him. So at that time, if you wanted to find out about West Montgomery, you could look around and you could dig some stuff up. But there wasn't anything about Lenny.
Hi everyone, welcome to Jazz Rocks with Adam. Today I have a very special guest, the author of the book, One Long Tune, The Life and Music of Lenny Breau. His book, One Long Tune, is the most extensive piece of literature on Lenny Breau. And I'm afraid that if the book didn't exist, I never would have been able to write a research paper on Lenny while I was doing my master's degree. Ron Forbes Roberts, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview.
My pleasure.
In doing a little research on you, I learned that Bravo Television Network did a special on the book. I guess Bravo was still a cool channel at that point.
You're telling me something that I'm completely unaware of.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I don't know where I ran across that link somewhere.
It's possible. I know that Chum TV out of Toronto did a special, and they interviewed me for it. Maybe they're affiliated with Bravo.
I don't know if they're anymore, but they used to be affiliated Bravo. It was the same.
There you go.
It was the same building and everything.
There you go.
So maybe they did broadcast it on Bravo as well, that you were unaware of. Because I wasn't aware of that either, because I think it said it was 2006, like maybe when the book came out or right after.
Yep.
So I was going to ask you if there was a way to watch it, but I guess you're not even aware of that.
You know what? I couldn't find it. Actually, at the time, I was notified about it, and there was just nowhere I could watch it. And
wow. Okay.
They sent me a transcript of the interview.
So, maybe you had to live in Toronto or something Ontario, maybe.
Yeah.
So speaking of location, where were you born?
Well, I was born in New Brunswick.
Okay.
And lived in the Maritimes when I was a kid. And my father was in the military, so we moved all over Eastern Canada and eventually wound up here in Vancouver.
Oh, okay. So that's basically where you grew up mostly was Vancouver? Because I know when you're a military kid, or sometimes as they say, a military brat, you grow up like all over the place. There's no sense of necessarily growing up in one area, right?
Right. Well, my father retired. We moved out here when I was, I think, a preteen. And I was here for another 3 or 4 years, and then all over the place. Lived in Victoria for a while, did a lot of traveling, and lived in Boston for 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was your life like growing up?
What was it like? Well, it was pretty ordinary. It was growing up in the 50s, and then the very contrasting 60s came along. And, I think I was a fairly conventional kid for both of those decades, considering my age at the time.
Well, I think it was a great time to grow up music-wise because
absolutely,
I've talked about this before. I mean, that's like when the Beatles hit. I mean, rock and roll became like really big at that point, and there was so much music to listen to. I've talked about this in other interviews and other videos that I've done where AM radio was a really cool thing, and then eventually FM was kind of cool at the beginning as well, but where you could like listen to a flamenco tune 1 minute, a country tune the next minute, and all of a sudden Led Zeppelin and the next song after that. Like it was pop radio literally was a mixture of pop music, right?
That's right. But there was a lot of wonderful stuff available on AM, and like a lot of other kids, I carried around a transistor radio with my ear glued to it, beginning when I was 12 or 13, and heard all that great music for the first time, probably on that transistor radio. So,
Yeah, I was born just the kind of tail end of that, I think. I was born in 1967, so I remember having a listening to AM radio under my pillow,
yeah, right.
trying to go to sleep, listening to just as much as the stuff I could find. And if on a good night you can get a transmit from somewhere far away that you normally wouldn't that one night for some reason. Yeah, it was very interesting time. Whiskey, wine, or beer?
Well, do you want me to list them in order of preference?
Just well, if there's one favorite.
I like a good whiskey
Okay.
in moderation, yeah,
Yeah.
and wine in slightly less moderation sometimes. You know,
Okay.
and on a, I can be persuaded to have a beer as well.
Sure. Okay. So the true Canadian answer. Yeah. I have been liking bourbon lately,
I'm a
and
bourbon fan.
yeah,
Yeah,
there's oh geez, I'll email it to you or something. But there's a really nice one that I've been drinking lately. I just for some reason I just can't think of it. Um,
Woodford Reserve.
no.
That's a really fine bourbon. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to. Maybe you should send me a list. It's kind of new to me, so
Yeah. Well,
and then
there's
it's
a lot to enjoy there.
yeah,
A lot of
yeah,
very
yeah.
good
And I
bourbons.
think it gets kind of sort of poo-pooed internationally because it's not like Scotch whiskey. But
That's
there's some
right.
good stuff, yeah.
There's some very good stuff. Yeah.
When did you start playing guitar and what were the first things that you started playing?
I started playing guitar in my mid-teens. So this would be at the end of the 60s.
Hmm.
And the kind of stuff that I was interested in, I was an enormous Bob Dylan fan, and that was really my impetus to start to learn some of those tunes. And yeah, so I learned to chord, and I was interested in singing in this originally this sort of atrocious Dylan-esque imitation, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I got into pop music, pop songs, singer-songwriter type things. A little later, the country rock thing happened, and I was quite interested in that. People like Graham Parsons, and I
Okay.
started playing that sort of thing. And but I never spent a lot of time expanding my abilities and knowledge on guitar back then. It was just a way to back my voice up. And I played with a couple little bands, little sort of acoustic, folky, country type bands, and yeah, never really dug into it very much.
So that was your backup band basically was your guitar.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So I know what were some of your earliest influences? I guess you mentioned Bob Dylan and the country rock thing.
I really liked initially people like, I mean, there was a whole other side to my listening. I mean, I listened to the Doors and Led Zeppelin and all that sort of thing, and I have to say Led Zeppelin had uh, it had a big effect on me when I really started playing guitar. The acoustic stuff that Jimmy Page did, you know.
Yeah.
But that wasn't a music that I was trying to play initially. You know, that was, it had to be something that just worked with guitar. So things like Gordon Lightfoot, I played some of his tunes and really whatever I could manage, you know.
It's amazing when I bring up Gordon Lightfoot, people go, "He's Canadian,"
Yeah.
which is like kind of weird to a Canadian because you obviously he's Canadian, but
Mhm.
because all of his lyrics and everything are so Canadian-esque or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned living in Boston for 10 years,
Yep.
I guess. What are some of the differences that you noticed living in the U.S. compared to Canada?
The biggest thing was the abundance of great music. You know,
Mm.
I remember one of the first month or two I was in Boston. I went out to a bar down the street from where I lived and saw George Garzone. I don't know if you know him.
Yo, I know who
Yeah,
that is.
right.
So yeah.
I'm glad. Playing in this little like a bar with
Mm-hmm.
in a band called The Fringe, and that was electrifying. There was a lot of stuff like that, not just in jazz but all kinds of things. I mean, there'd be these wonderful string quartets giving free concerts in various places. So there was that. It was just mind-blowing.
So how did you become an author? What is your background and experience as a writer? Is One Long Tune your first foray into being an author?
Not exactly. um, when I was in my 40s, early 40s, so this would be mid 90s,
Okay.
I wrote a small article for a music store that I was working at. They wanted to do a promotional thing, and somebody wanted them to do a little piece that they could put in their publication. And I volunteered to do it, but I had no writing background at all. And the publication thought it was quite good and encouraged me to do more. And really, within about a year or a year and a half, I was writing a lot. I was writing for a local newspaper. Uh, I was a contributing editor to Acoustic Guitar magazine, and doing lots and lots of freelance stuff, mainly about music, but other things as well. Yeah. And in there, I mean, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the whole process of writing, and I had been thinking about doing a larger project. And then a few years later, the idea of doing a biography about Lenny Breau came to mind. But there's a long history to that. It's not something that I thought about overnight.
Right. Trust me, you're leading into that.
I'm sure you are.
How did I know you sort of got to see Lenny perform at least once? Did you ever get to meet Lenny or take a lesson with him or anything?
No, no.
Okay.
I saw him at a disastrous concert at the Arts Club Theatre here in Vancouver.
Which you wrote in the book, yeah.
That's right, yeah. And it was not his best moment.
Right. Well, that leads me to, what was the impetus for you to write the book?
Well, I had heard Lenny for the first time in the mid-'70s. And
was that because of how cool AM radio was?
no, not at all.
Oh, okay.
Not at all. My girlfriend at the time moved into an apartment. This was in Victoria, where the former residents had left behind a pile of trash in the kitchen, and on the bottom of that pile of trash was Lenny Breau's second album, The Velvet Touch of Lenny Breau Live. I'd never heard of the guy.
Wow.
He thought because it had a picture of a guy with a guitar on the front that I would like it, and she was right. And now at the time, I was heavily into guitar. I sort of come out of my strumming, chording phase, and I was actually applying myself to learning to play the guitar as a solo instrument. And but I was not into jazz at all.
Mm.
So when I heard that album, it just blew me away. But not because I recognized it as being innovative jazz guitar playing or anything like that. It just really moved me.
Just the emotion, right?
It was beautiful musical poetry with great emotive content, and that really grabbed me. And his way of moving the mood of a song, from great joy to poignancy, and then humor, and it just seemed to flow out of him. And
right.
I was really taken with that. I mean, later on, I got into the technique, and when I became more into jazz and was listening to lots of jazz guitarists, I recognized where he stood there.
Right.
That added to the whole thing.
Yeah, I didn't really. I'm trying to think of how I first learned of Lenny. It was probably through Guitar Player magazine when he did those articles.
Yeah.
And that's probably where I first heard the name, I think. But then I did go to Humber College and then to study jazz. And that's where my connection with Peter Harris came in. But again, maybe we'll leave that for a little bit later.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. I'm sure the book was a labor of love because I just can't imagine how much work went into that. Can you let everyone know how much research you actually did for the book? I know it was really extensive.
Well, I spent about 5 years, and I wasn't doing it 8 hours a day, although during the last couple of years, my life was pretty much revolved around the book. I interviewed about 200 people. And although not all of those interviews surface in the book, pretty much everybody I talked to had something to contribute. And of course, there were some Maine people. So I had to travel to do that. And I spent about a month in Winnipeg, talked to a lot of folks there, Toronto, Maine, and Nashville. About a month in each one of those places.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you get any funding for that at all, or was that kind of out of all of your own pocket? Because that must be a lot of hotel rooms and spending money on your own.
It was out of my pocket, out of my own pocket. Yeah, it was okay. I made a decision to do it, and it was, I had some means at the time. It meant taking, I was doing a lot of teaching at that point and some gigs. So it meant taking a lot of time off of that to do it, but it was preferable.
Right. Yeah. Well, sometimes you just need a break.
Yeah, right.
And as much as work as that is, at least it's, doing something that you want to get the word out and you want to do it right.
That's right.
Yeah. There are so many things in the book that were surprising to me to discover. Because I did own a hardcover book when it first came out, but with so many moves, I've misplaced it. I don't know where it is. Maybe it's at my ex-wife's place. I don't know. But I had to buy the book, and I reread the whole thing again. Anyway, so to get back to the question, I'm sure that this would apply to a lot of people, that there's things that you've discovered from your research that many people didn't know, because he was kind of a bit of an enigmatic figure. I can't help but think that Lenny teaching himself accordion at age 3 or 4 for 2 years before he got into guitar must have heavily influenced his guitar playing later on, more than probably he realized.
His mother told me about this. And what really came through to me when she told me about it was Lenny's persistence. And he locked himself in his room with the accordion was broken.
Yeah.
Missing a note. And he would practice these tunes, or one tune, over and over again. Every time he get to that note, he'd curse and he'd try it again. And I always thought that was sort of an embodiment of Lenny Breau's personality, his persistence, his tenacity, his will to overcome barriers in his music. And it was there at the beginning, and he was hooked and he was obsessed and he was going to make it work even when it was impossible.
And at 3 or 4 years old, or whatever, however old he was, I think that's how old he was. I was also amazed to learn that Reg Kelln, which was Lenny's drummer in his infamous trio, his most famous trio at least anyway, that may have been the one that introduced him to flamenco. And I have to guess that maybe it was one of his records that he gave Lenny that was probably Sabicus, I would imagine. Yeah.
That's I remember Reg telling me that he gave Lenny some of his record collection, and that was one of the tunes, and maybe another one was Barney Kessel. And Lenny was really gripped by both of those albums, and so his Yeah, the flamenco thing was interesting because when he got into flamenco, he was in Winnipeg, not exactly a flamenco hotbed,
Right.
But there were people in the prairies who were doing it, and I wish that I could remember the name of the guy in Edmonton who probably gave Lenny some, I wouldn't say lessons, but basic knowledge about flamenco guitar. This guy was a flamenco and classical guitar player. He was also a guitar builder.
I sorry to cut you off, but I think I can't remember the name either, but it was someone that may have met Carlos Montoya or something like that. Was it that guy?
You know what? I've got the book right here, man. Frank Gay.
Okay.
Yeah, Frank Gay was a guy who had his fingers in a lot of pies, and one of the things he did was he was a distributor for Western Canada of Ramirez guitars.
Right.
And word has it that he procured for Carlos Montoya a flamenco guitar, a Ramirez flamenco guitar, although I find that story a bit odd because why would a guy who lived in Spain and was the best known flamenco guitarist in the world need to get, but who knows?
Mm-hmm.
It may be that Frank Gay met Carlos Montoya at a concert in Edmonton. And but it's interesting because Carlos Montoya, there's a whole mythology about Lenny, and all these funny little anecdotes about him that don't really hold water. And Carlos Montoya figures in a number of those. There's a story that Lenny bought his first guitar from Carlos Montoya.
I
Also,
remember.
a guy in Toronto told me that he met Lenny when Lenny had just come back from Spain, where he'd been taking lessons with Carlos Montoya. This is like many years later.
Right.
So strangely enough, he pops up quite a bit, but I don't really know what the connection would be.
Yeah, maybe Lenny borrowed the story from Frank Gay of meeting him, maybe.
It could well be.
Yeah.
It could well be.
Hey everyone, I'm sorry to interrupt the video, but when I was editing the video here, I just realized that I forgot to ask Ron 2 questions that were really important. At least I thought they were important to me. So I reached out to Ron and he was gracious enough to record his response to these 2 questions. The first question that popped up from reading his book was that I didn't know that Lenny owned a harp guitar or a 9-string guitar. This was back in the 1960s. So let's let Ron explain.
Lenny ran across a Gibson harp guitar, 1905 model, in a pawn shop in Winnipeg. So a harp guitar has a large body, has a 6-string neck, and then it has on a frame, it has a number of bass strings, somewhere around 6 to 8. It differs on the model. So these bass strings go really, really low. I mean, they're about the size of some of the higher piano strings. And Lenny, according to Ron Halldorson, who watched Lenny play this thing, Lenny loved to play a bass note, let it ring, then play a couple of chords, play another bass note, let it ring, and play a couple of chords. Now, he wasn't really playing jazz on it. But he was obviously interested, even at that point, in finding a way to extend the range of a guitar. He actually used that instrument on stage when he toured with Don Franks, when he did gigs with the Don Franks, Ian Henstridge, and himself, the trio called Three, in New York and Toronto and in that area. And it was more a little, Don Frank said it was a little more of a novelty thing, but a beautiful sound. But then a couple of years after that, Lenny got quite interested in extending the range of the guitar, and he worked out an idea for a guitar that had 9 strings. So an extra bass string, and 2 upper treble strings, or vice versa. I can't remember. I have to check my book. Anyway, it had 9 strings, and it was, he talked to a luthier named Frank Gay in Edmonton about building this for him. Frank Gay said, I'll tell you what, give me the body of a regular electric guitar and I will build you a neck that'll work for a 9-string guitar. So that's what Lenny did. He gave him the body of his Gibson ES 125. And Gay designed and put on the guitar a much wider neck. And Lenny strung it with 9 strings. He and Bob Erlendson discussed it, and the guitar was tuned in 4ths, beginning with a low A string. Bob Erlendson still has this guitar, and he's experimented with different tunings on it. Lenny found it a bit of a challenge. The strings were, I believe, a little bit too close together to do much with, and he stumbled on it a little bit. But it was really the beginning of Lenny's quest to find a guitar with extended range. I mean, he settled on the 7-string guitar that Kirk Sand built for him much later on. At one point in the early 70s, Lenny had an acoustic, I believe it was an aria that had a 6-string and a 12-string neck on it. And then just before his death, he had been talking to Kirk Sand about building an electric guitar with a 6-string and 12-string neck. It never got built, unfortunately, but the template for it still exists in the Kirk Sand studios.
Ron mentioned in his book that he listened to a recording of Lenny playing bass. It was a remote recording from a radio station associated with a college or university, CKUA, and Lenny was playing bass on this, and apparently it's so good. Don Thompson mentioned this to me as well. He thought that when he heard Lenny play, he didn't mention that it was a recording, but he thought Lenny was miles and miles ahead of what anybody was doing on bass at that time. Don Thompson told me that it reminded him of Jaco Pastorius. Now, mind you, this is like 15 years, 10 to 15 years before Jaco ever came out on the scene. So I thought that was really, really interesting. So let's just let Ron expand on that.
So when Lenny first started playing professional jazz gigs, he was working with Bob Erlendson, his buddy and mentor, and Bob was a great jazz pianist. Bob thought it'd be a good idea for Lenny, rather than playing guitar, for Lenny to play bass, so he could, learn the nuts and bolts of jazz theory and harmony. So Bob bought himself a Hofner electric bass. According to Bob, it was the first electric bass in Canada, actually. And 6 nights a week, they would play together, and Lenny would be holding down the bottom end with bass. But he was doing more than, in time, was doing a lot more than holding down the bottom end. He developed into a really remarkable bass player in about a year. As far as I know, there are no recordings of Bob and Lenny at the stage door, but there is a recording of Lenny in Edmonton at the Yardbird Suite, playing with a group of Edmonton jazz musicians who had hired him to play bass. And this group was a very high energy bebop group. And on their first night, the University of Alberta set up recording equipment and recorded them. And on one of their songs, a song called Spontaneous Combustion, Lenny takes a solo. And I don't mean a solo over the band. The band stops playing and Lenny plays solo. I haven't heard it for a while. It may have the drummer keeping a pulse on the hi-hat or something, but it's all Lenny playing this bass. And the solo is extraordinary, way ahead of its time. Lenny is playing these very fast, sometimes melodic, sometimes dissonant phrases, followed by these slides. He bends the strings of the bass sometimes. He builds the whole thing up to this climax. It's just unbelievable. It's quite a stellar performance. Don Thompson told me that he heard that tape back around 1962. Don Thompson, the great Canadian bass player, piano player, vibe player. And he said at that time, Lenny was ahead of every bass player in Canada, at least. And I've never heard jazz, an electric jazz bass played like that. Certainly at that time in history, 1962. Don said that it was like Jaco Pastorius. That's who he compared Lenny to. So Lenny was, if he auditioned with anybody at that time for a position for bass player, he probably would have got the gig. He was really good.
Speaking of Ian Tyson before, I was surprised to learn that Ian Tyson was Don Frank's guitar player before Lenny. Maybe you can fill in briefly who Ian Tyson is for the American listeners, the non-Canadian viewers of this video.
Sure enough. Ian Tyson was born in Victoria in the early 30s and always had a hankering for horses, rodeos, that kind of thing. And he actually participated in some rodeos and was injured during one of them. And in the hospital, he started playing guitar. And he started doing cowboy songs and that kind of thing. He went to art school in Vancouver, and then he traveled to Toronto, I guess in the late 50s, early 60s, was big into straight up folk music. He met a woman named Sylvia Fricker. They started this group, Ian and Sylvia, and very quickly they had enormous success. They were managed by Bob Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman. And they had an enormous Canadian hit. I don't know how it did in the United States, but an enormous Canadian hit with a song called Four Strong Winds, which is a great Canadian classic. So Ian Tyson was not a spectacular guitar player. He's kind of a spectacular singer and sometimes a spectacular songwriter. But I guess maybe, when Don Franks was starting to do his thing in Toronto, maybe guitar players were rare.
Maybe it was just, maybe they just had a great time with a few drinks and that's it. You're my guitar player. Who knows? Right?
That could be. I can't imagine that their association lasted very long.
Right. And they were sort of in their height in that Yorkville area, famous Yorkville area of Toronto, when Lenny was there in that area as well, like playing at the Boathouse and
that's right,
and all that as well, I would imagine.
Yep, I suppose.
Maybe you can help me with this because of your extensive research. I asked Lauren Lofsky this when I interviewed him. Well, what's your opinion? Who do you think started playing in that more pianistic way first, Ed Bickert or Lenny? That's it's sort of something that I've had, a question that's been itching at me for many, many, many years.
Well, I may not be the person to ask because I'm a huge fan of Ed Bickert. I love his playing. I'm not quite clear on his development as a player though. So I don't know. I know that in 1962, Lenny was already had that style under his fingers. I'm not sure that he was actually improvising in that style at that point. He was certainly doing lots of single line stuff. Mm-hmm. And I've heard very early recordings, 1958, 1959, where Lenny had sort of thrown together these jazz chord solo things, but that took from Johnny Smith, for example. Right. They weren't really improvised either, but he was on that road. So I'm not sure, but he was definitely working towards it around 1960, 1961.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure exactly when Ed Bickert sort of started playing professionally either. But I always had a inkling that maybe they were both doing it around the same time, and that maybe Lenny kind of beat him to it a little bit. But then again, there's a lot of Ed Bickert records early on that are like out of print that you can't go back and listen to.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
So I just thought maybe I just wanted your opinion on it. That's all. Just in case it was something that you sort of asked yourself as well when you were doing some research.
I talked to Ed Bickert.
Mm-hmm.
I interviewed him, and he was very forthcoming. And what he said was he first saw Lenny Breau in Toronto in 1962. And he didn't say this about himself, but my sense was that he was fairly firm in the position of being the best guitarist in Toronto by quite a long shot at that time, or at least very well known and doing a lot of work in the city. And when I asked him what he felt when he first saw Lenny, he said really quickly, jealousy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he expanded on that and said that Lenny was doing things that were not in his universe at that time, in Ed's universe. But he was talking about a number of things Lenny was doing. The flamenco thing. He was astonished by how many things. So whether or not he was floored by Lenny's pianistic approach to guitar at the time, I'm just not really clear on. I've seen in articles where he has praised Lenny for doing something similar to what he's doing, but I think he was really that kind of guy. He's a very humble man, and
yeah, that's true. Yeah, I have very little interaction with Ed Bickert. I only talked to him one time. It was at the Rex Hotel. I had just got done playing, coming down off the stage, and there he was.
Wow.
It was like, oh, you heard me, kind of thing. But yeah, we had and I said, oh, I'm, I was like, because I just started playing fingerstyle, and Lenny was kind of, that style was new to me at the time. And I said, yeah, I'm kind of playing in this Lenny Breau style now. It's a bit new. And he's like, oh, okay. Just very nonchalant or whatever. And then he's like, I like most of what you played. But I told that same story to Lorne, and Lorne Lofsky said that, well, Ed was a man of few words.
Yeah.
And not once when Lorne Lofsky was playing with him did he ever comment on anything he played or whatever. Just one time when they were in Spain, I think he said in the car that one time he was in the back seat and he just said, "You've been doing some mighty fine picking there lately, son." And that was that was like kind of like when he said to me, "I like most of what you played." That was like, "I'll take it."
Sure.
That's probably a huge compliment coming.
Abusive for him, it sounds like. Yeah.
Yeah. I got to know Stephen D. Anderson somewhat.
Right.
And I'm sure you interviewed him in Toronto
Yes.
as well. I used to stay at his place a couple of times when I went
in
down
Nashville?
there. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Right, exactly. When I'd go down to teach in Nashville, I think it was for about 2 or 3 years in a row. And he used to show me around where Lenny lived and stuff, and and sometimes where him and Lenny lived at one point. One of them was just down the street from the RCA building, where sometimes his wife would be banging on the door at 3:00 in the morning or whatever. But what insight did you get about Lenny from Stephen? I'm assuming it was a different angle than most of the people you probably interviewed?
Stephen knew Lenny on let's say, a very kind of grassroots sort of level. I think the story was that Stephen had got turned on to Lenny by Danny Davis, who produced Lenny's second album, and listened to him and listened to those records and was blown away by him. And then Lenny came to town, and Stephen Anderson thought he was dead. Lenny hadn't been heard of in a long, long while.
As a lot of other people from what you wrote in the book probably assumed that he was no longer on the planet.
Yeah, that's right. So Stephen amazed me because he had picked up so much of what Lenny did. I mean, to my ear, he is really one of the most advanced players in Lenny's style, though he has his own thing in there as well. And it didn't sound like it took him a lot of work,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think it helps when you're around Lenny a lot, because he would pick his brain. And
yes,
I remember we had our guitars out at his place one time, and he was showing me how he could bend his fourth finger, or if you're not a guitar player, your pinky finger, in a way that Lenny was jealous. Like, how do you do that? Where he could like bar two or three strings with just that one finger and get chords that Lenny couldn't do.
right.
With things like that. But yeah, he would, we would kind of talk shop, and we would talk about things. And yeah, so talk about being able to pick Lenny's brain directly on the same couch that you may share. Being a house in the same household, it would be certainly advantageous.
Stephen really seemed to have this far-ranging musical interest. I think in the 80s he played in a pop band that he was very keen on, and traveled and toured with them. And he also did some solo acoustic playing and singing songs that he wrote. So he was just really all over the map.
Yeah, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he may have told me that. What's the capital city of Georgia again? Atlanta. There was some kind of an Atlanta connection that he had as well, and it was around the time that that was kind of like a new wave.
REM?
Not REM.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit before that.
Okay.
But Love Shack was one of their songs.
Oh, was it the B-52s?
B-52s, yeah. I think he may have opened for that band or something like that, with that pop band that we were talking about. Or I think I remember him telling there was some kind of connection. And speaking of another Nashville person that I also consider a friend, John Knowles.
Yes.
Seems to have a different point of view than many of the stories that pop up in your book, where Lenny seems to get nervous before performing and because he was having to prove that he was like the best guitar player ever. Where according to John, he didn't seem to care about that kind of thing at all from his vantage point.
Right.
I find that kind of curious, because where a lot of people you interviewed, were saying he would get nervous and maybe do some things that he shouldn't have been doing.
Right.
Where John was like, he didn't care about anything. He would play in front of people. And
well, that's really an interesting point, because I heard stories like that, conflicting stories like that, really from the beginning. In the Winnipeg session or studio scene that Lenny was in with CBC.
Right.
People told me that Lenny would just come in to these sessions. He couldn't read very well, and the band would play through some chart, and Lenny would just wing it, and just as calmly as you can imagine would just play some stunning solo. other people told me the opposite of that, that he was constantly stressed by the, so he was a moody guy. You know, it could really depend where he was, what he was doing. Um,
Who was around him, maybe too. Maybe the more people
Super
that he
important
considered
for him.
closer friends, he maybe wouldn't get as nervous.
Well, yeah, except that he did a lot of gigs with Brad Terry where he would actually not play at the last moment, wouldn't take the stage. And Brad Terry was, I think, he was about as comfortable with Brad Terry as he could be with anybody.
Right.
I think he was just a moody guy. And I certainly don't think that he ever wanted to really prove. It wasn't important for him to get up on stage and prove his prowess and virtuosity. I think that he may have felt at times that he was being judged, and it really interfered with what he wanted to do, which had nothing to do with any kind of musical competition.
Right, because I do feel exactly the same way, that Lenny felt that competition in music was a really big turnoff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Likely, I'm guessing because he believed that to get like into the real depth of inside music that he was always striving for was to remove as much of the ego as possible, where you know, this macho bravado side of things is the complete opposite of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think Lenny was all about expression, and I think in his many of his performances, you know, he was aware of the audience and he wanted to connect with the audience, but it was a learning experience for him too.
Right.
John Knowles told me a story about Lenny playing in a small church somewhere for a handful of people, and he played, you know, Autumn Leaves, and he just went deeper and deeper and deeper into it than John Knowles had ever heard him play. You know, just John Knowles described it as just layers and layers deep. And it sounded like he was having kind of a profound experience there on stage. That doesn't have anything to do with, you know, trying to impress people.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, at the end of the concert, he stopped and nobody applauded. They were just stunned. And then this little girl ran down the aisle and hugged him.
Right.
You know? So I think that's more what he was about, rather than being a gunslinger. That just doesn't fit with his thing at all, I don't think.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't. I just can't see it either. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think John Knowles, when I interviewed him, told the same story, but I don't think he mentioned it was Autumn Leaves. I think it was My Funny Valentine.
My Funny Valentine.
Yeah. Even though she didn't respond, how did you manage to track down Joanne Deborah Glasscock, otherwise known by anyone that knows of Lenny's history as Jewel?
I looked her up in the phone book, I think.
Wow. Okay.
This is a long time ago, so let me think a second. There were a number of Glasscocks living in, what's the town in? Stockton, California. So she was there, and I had managed to find her birth certificate or her marriage license or something which mentioned her hometown. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because on her marriage certificate, she lied about her age and knocked 10 years off of it. Anyway, wow. So I couldn't actually connect with her. So I called up somebody who I thought might be a relative of hers. And it turned out to be her sister. And wow. I said I was doing this book, and I really wanted to talk to her, and I had some questions for her, and I wasn't doing a hatchet job on her or anything. And to see if she could arrange to set me up to talk to Jewel, and she was very earnest and keen on doing it. And then when I called back about 2 weeks later, she hung up on me. So yeah, I kind of got the picture, and I really didn't want to push with that. So
Yeah. No, I hear you. Yeah. I while I was researching some stuff on you to come up with some questions, I think I ran across her Lenny's daughter, also Stockton, California, I think. So
is that Dawn Marie? Is that her name?
I
Or something
think so.
yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I just found a couple of little things, like maybe it was like Facebook or something, or I can't remember now, but yeah, she's like 40 something years old now or something. Can you possibly expound on the part of your book, if you remember, about Ron Halldorson realizing a certain look on Lenny's face when he was playing with Tal Farlow? Did Ron get into any greater detail about that when you interviewed him?
You know what? I'd have to go back and look.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember that.
Because
Really.
I know he seemed to take that as a positive sign at the time.
Right. I can only imagine that. And who was the guy who did the film? Lorenzo Di Stefano, who did the film on Tal that Lenny was in, said that Lenny was just absolutely tickled, to meet him,
Right.
because he was a huge influence on him early
Right.
on. Yeah, yeah,
And we mentioned Peter Harris before.
yeah.
He popped up in your book, and the guitar that Lenny gave him, I remember that guitar really well. I remember him playing it in lessons at Humber College with him. And matter of fact, his son, Chris Harris, asked me if I wanted to buy that guitar. And this was, I think, around 2015, 2016. And at the time, I just couldn't do it. It just wasn't feasible. But if it was right now, if he reached out to me right now, I would snatched it up in a second.
Yeah, right.
But it's too bad. But Emily asked me about that too, because I mentioned that guitar to her, because she would want it. I think. So I know she has another Tom Holmes guitar that Lenny owned,
Right.
I believe. And it was, far to my knowledge, it was I gave Chris the advice to take it to the 12th Fret, which is a fairly famous guitar store in Toronto, and have them fix it up and maybe sell it for him or whatever, because he said it needed a lot of work. It had been in the basement for years and years and years, and there were parts rusting on it and stuff. And
Right.
so
if you through them in the end,
I think so. Like if you go to the 12th Fret website, they have it listed there, but I think it as sold.
Right.
And I never bothered to follow up with Chris Harris to see if it had been sold or anything like that. So
I should tell you that the person who told me about Peter Harris owning that guitar was you.
Oh, okay.
I'd never heard of Peter Harris. I had no idea what happened to that guitar. And then you and I both belonged to a shrine long ago.
Okay, yeah.
Before the book, and you brought that up in the.
That's like MySpace days or something.
That's right. I think it predated MySpace. Yeah.
Sure, I was probably just early on getting to the internet then, because I didn't even own a computer until 2002, maybe.
Yeah, this would be around that time, I think.
Okay.
And you pulled my sleeve about that, so it went in the book. And you seemed like a reliable source, so.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's the same strap, that thick strap that Lenny, that you see him playing that same guitar with Tal Farlow, I think, in that same video. So yeah, it's really bizarre. And he would fold it up in the case probably the same way Lenny did. He would put the strap in a certain way because it was so thick you couldn't put it in any other way. Probably because it was so neck heavy, you needed a thick strap to keep it from falling over, I think.
The whole thing looked like it weighed a ton, right?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I ever picked it up or anything like that, because probably Peter Harris would maybe would have sliced your throat if he knew you even touched it. And I'm sure, I think how he inherited it is that I think Peter Harris told me that he loaned Lenny some money and never got the money back. So Lenny just said, "Here's the guitar."
Yeah. Yeah,
Never,
that sounds familiar.
As collateral, and never came back to get it or anything like that.
And he got his Kirk Sand guitar around that time, or was it his second Tom Holmes? I'm not sure. Some guitar, he was waiting for a guitar at that time. It was probably his second Tom Holmes, I think. I'd have to check my book, you know.
Might have been, yeah. I just remember it had a very, very wide neck on it, even wider than my 7-string that I have now.
Right.
Which, you know, I tune it, obviously inspired by Lenny. I tuned it that same way with the high A string. And yeah, it was super wide. You'd be able to, it's probably like as wide as maybe an 8-string guitar is that they sell now.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So considerably wider than a classical neck, like a 2-inch classical.
That's what I remember. I just remember looking at the guitar going, holy geez, that neck is really wide. But Peter Harris was a big guy. He was probably 6'2", 6'3", and he had really big hands, so it suited him perfectly.
Right.
And that's all he had played. He may have had different guitars at home, but that guitar lived in his teaching studio at Humber.
Right.
I don't know if he ever took it out of there or not. That's what I remember anyway. It was just always there on a stand.
Yeah. Lenny had fairly small hands.
Yeah.
You know? But he had what some small-handed guitarists have, this incredible ability to stretch. You know, I know another player like that, Mike Rudd. I don't know if you know him. He just has smallish hands, and yet he could make these huge chords. His hands would just seem to expand. And
that name does ring a bell. I just don't know it.
He's well known out in these parts. I think he's
okay.
a Calgary player, great jazz player. Yeah.
Yeah. My hands aren't really that big either. Sort of taken after my dad, although my dad has what I refer to as sausage fingers. Mine aren't quite as thick.
Right.
But they're not really that long. I have guitar students that are younger than me, way, you know, like in their teens, that have bigger hands than I do. I think kind of the same way, is that I can stretch pretty far. For some reason, I don't know why. I can play chords that a lot of people can't, that seem to have bigger hands, that you would think, well, how come you can't do it?
Yeah.
I know it's been many years now, but can you think of some interesting things that didn't end up in the book? Because I think it's been a long time. I know that's probably a hard question to answer, because I'm sure you couldn't put everything in the book.
When I did the first draft of the book, it was approaching 800 pages. And so there were certainly some things that were whittled out. And, you know, I mean, it had reached that length before I found a publisher. And then when I started like looking at publishers, the publishers said, there's no way we're going to publish an 800 page book. Mm-hmm. So I whittled it down considerably, which was a good thing. I mean, not that I planned to use everything in there to begin with, but there was, as you know, a dark, unhappy side to Lenny's life, mm-hmm. you know, from fairly early on. And I had never intended to use all of that sort of thing, but to get the book down to a manageable size, I took a lot of that out, as I was going to do anyway. So there are those kind of stories, and I've forgotten a lot of those, you know, because they didn't really interest me. I think more I would have concentrated certain things, you know, say Lenny's first recording session in Nashville. I probably would have reduced that, but I don't think that I left out any pertinent stories, you know, any anything that would have been of really major interest.
Did you have to? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off.
no, go ahead.
I thought you were
Go ahead.
done.
I am.
Did you have to take a step back from that once you got the sort of 800 pages, and then not look at it for a while to come back with some fresh eyes to realize what you were going to take out? Because that would be hard for me to do, because I would almost want to keep everything, probably just as my nature.
Right.
So it must have been it would be hard, I would imagine, to other than, like, obviously, like you said, the dark side, you're gonna take that stuff, most of that stuff out first. I would probably do the same, but anything else from that I would imagine would be like, I'd be wringing my hands, like, what should I take out?
Right. Well, that's you know, that's, I think, part of the art is forcing yourself to edit, you know, and just biting the bullet and thinking, how crucial is this information? Do I really have to talk about, it's occurred to me now that some of what I took out had to do with Hal Lomepine and Betty's early career and all the places they played and many of the musicians that they played with. I thought, is that really pertinent? Do I need 8 examples of that? How about just one good one? And the great thing about, you know, editing is that once it's disappeared from your screen, man, it's gone. And it doesn't seem to matter. And if it does matter, well, then you'll probably bring it back, you know.
Right. Yeah,
So
you'll find your notes somewhere and bring. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
If it bothers you that you've left something out, you can retrieve it. But usually you have a sense of what works and what doesn't.
Well, reading it, I thought that didn't seem like there was any extraneous stuff in there.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, I matter of fact, I'm probably maybe one of the few that would have liked to know even more. Like, all the stuff with his parents, all that I found interesting. So
Yeah.
and all the different people that he played with and the people that were in his parents' band, and because I think you did whittle it down to, like, if you could get any a perfect amount of words to portray whatever you wanted to, I think that was it, because it was interesting that was definitely a time in Lenny's life that was very formative, and you know, all the people that had played in his parents' band and stuff, and things that he gleaned from them, and people teaching him how to sort of pick, like Chet was very interesting and important.
It's just something. I remembered something that has to do with that. I was fascinated by Hal and Betty's story. I mean, really fascinated by it.
Like, you'd almost write a book on that, on them alone. Right?
Absolutely. I always had a big interest in country music, and that was one of my early pulls to Lenny. Was I just couldn't make the connection between, you know, the country and Western world that he grew up in and this really cutting edge, sophisticated jazz guitarist that he went on to be. I mean, I more understand that now. I didn't at the time. But I always thought those figures who were making country music in the 40s and 50s were extremely interesting people, and not widely written about, really. I mean, like in the Ken Burns country thing, I mean, you know, he never, it sounded like there were half a dozen country acts in the 40s and 50s, when in fact there were hundreds, you know. Charlie Hayden's family were just like Lenny's, traveling around, and Charlie Hayden was part of that band, you know, when he was a kid. And so I was really interested in them, Betty, Cody, and Hal. I thought they were very charismatic, groundbreaking people. And so initially, I think in early drafts of the book, there was a huge amount about them and how they came up and the people that they met and what their influences were, because that music may seem a bit dowdy to us now, But in 1935, man, it was right out in front. It was besides swing jazz, it was probably one of the hottest things that was happening, particularly in New England, and where they came from. So,
Well, I remember bringing Hal Pine and Betty Cody up to my mother, and she goes, "Oh yeah, I remember listening to them on the radio."
yep, yeah, that's right.
So they were fairly big stars, and I think Betty Cody was on a track to get even more fame happening than Hal Pine. From what I remember.
Yeah, Betty fit in with the Kitty Wells thing that was going on at the time, and she had this sort of early feminist voice. She did these answer songs, right? Something about, what was the tune? Kitty Wells' tune, "It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels," is an answer to an earlier country song that said, "You must be a honky tonk angel." Well, Betty kind of picked up on that, or the people who wrote her songs sort of picked up on that. And she was this earnest, innocent, clean living woman who sang about the foibles of being involved with, these honky tonking men,
Right.
So, and that was something that was happening at the time in the 50s. Hal's music didn't really progress. He stayed with country and western that was really popular in the 30s and 40s. He really stayed there until the end of his career, not quite to the end of his career. He put out an album of more updated songs, and he took off his suit and wore ordinary clothes and that kind of thing. But so Betty pulled out in front of him because she was just in her way a whole lot hipper than he was.
Right.
And but that's not to knock Hal. He was a very interesting man. He was a great showman, and he was one of the earliest country stars in New England.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it stems from the Gene Autry and
Exactly.
Like stuff that my grandfather would have been influenced by listening to.
Yeah.
Because my grandfather was always into horses and stuff like that, and had a horse farm later on in life, and I think he watched so many Gene Autry movies and the like of the day that he almost talked like he was from the States, not from Canada. Like,
right,
he would say, you better wash up and go to the toilet or something,
Yeah,
like that. He would sometimes, that would slip out of his mouth but yeah. So it was at that time, all that stuff was a big influence on society for sure.
That's right. Lots of big radio shows, and we had our own guy up here. His name, unfortunately, I can't remember. It was quite popular.
Like Wolf Carter.
Wilf Carter. That's what I was trying to think of. Yeah, he was huge.
Wolf Carter, Stompin' Tom was, I guess, more not necessarily like straight ahead country, almost more folk, but kind of had some country elements.
Definitely influenced by those guys. And then there was a guy named Alberta Slim who knew Betty Cody and Hal in the Maritimes way back in the day. And he ended up out here selling real estate. But there were a lot. Those people were a really interesting breed. Yeah.
Well, is there any potential for a follow-up book with any new info, stories, or any recordings that have popped up since?
Not really. I think that there's a chapter that remains to be written, maybe, which is, of course, how Lenny died and the circumstances around that.
Right.
And when I got to that point in the book, I made a decision not to go too deeply into that.
Mm-hmm.
I really wanted it to be about his life. I didn't really want to turn it into a murder mystery, and it's impossible to smooth over what happened to the guy, and end the book on an up note. It's just. but I didn't really want to belabor it and drag it out. And really, there's just not that much information on it. So.
Even still, like I remember hearing, oh geez, when was that? That was maybe around 2010, 2011. I heard that they were opening up the case again, and I thought, oh, maybe something is going to happen and get solved, but I've never heard anything.
I know that Emily Hughes is, of course, very keen on that, and I think she has tried to make some inroads. I think she has talked to the Los Angeles Police Department, but it's a 40-year-old murder, and my sense, and I don't know this for sure, this is speculation, but my sense is that it was a bit bungled. The investigation was a bit bungled in the early part of it. I did talk to one of the investigating officers on the scene, and he could barely remember it. He knew there'd been some fuss about it, but he told me that right at that time he was starting his career case, which happens to some detectives who have these cases that they pursue for 10 years, and that had happened to him. So everything else just went out of his mind.
Right.
Yeah, my sense was that it really was not a well-handled case at the beginning, and it was viewed as probably another drug murder.
Right, and I just kind of wrote it off at that, probably,
or did a minimal amount of work. I don't know. I may be completely wrong about that, but yeah,
maybe we'll never know.
We may never know.
Right.
Yeah. Somebody knows. Somebody somewhere knows, as they say.
Well, maybe on a happier note, are there any musicians that you've been following lately that you admire in any genre? It doesn't have to be jazz or anything.
Well, I've actually been in this process of, especially during the last couple of years, I've had a lot of time on my hands. I've been in the process of going back and listening to people that I either missed out on back in the day or didn't really spend a lot of time listening to. One person you might be amazed to know is Herbie Hancock. Mm-hmm. Who, of course, I was aware of, and I heard him with Miles, and but I've really dug into him and collected all his albums from the beginning to the not quite up to his funk rappy kind of thing. I'm not quite there, but
right.
So yeah, that sort of thing, and 50s jazz. Which is really my favorite period of jazz, listening to a lot of that stuff that I missed out on, the more esoteric people. So there's that. There's nobody I can think of who has really grabbed me, but I'm a bit out of touch with that sort of thing. So
that's okay. I thought I would just ask. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about or wanted to mention?
Well, a question I've always wanted to be asked is why I wrote the book.
Yeah, well, that I thought I asked that, but maybe I wasn't clear enough.
Well, you sort of did.
Sorry.
You said it was a labor of love, but I just want to expand on that a little bit.
Sure. And by all means,
it has more to do with Lenny than it does with me, really.
Sure.
Is that when I first heard Lenny, which would be about 1975, there was almost nothing known about the guy unless you lived in Winnipeg or Toronto. And there were, I think, one or two magazine articles about Lenny in Guitar Player magazine, and that gave a little bit of an outline to his life, but not much. So there was very little documented about him. So at that time, if you wanted to find out about West Montgomery, you could look around and you could dig some stuff up. But there wasn't anything about Lenny, really.
Almost more like folklore or stories or something, right?
That's what I'm getting at, man.
Yeah.
And the The way I heard about Lenny was through word of mouth. You know, in 1975, when I first heard Lenny, I was taking some classical guitar lessons. I mentioned Lenny Breau to my classical teacher, and amazingly, he knew him.
Mm.
And he said, yeah, I've got a friend in Vancouver who played bass with him for a while. And then he proceeded to tell me these stories about Lenny. And that's the way it went for about the next 15 years. I'd run into somebody from Winnipeg who had known Lenny back in the day, or somebody from Toronto. So it's almost as though Lenny had this mythology. He really was legendary. He wasn't widely known. He was below most people's radar, but he was preceded by this word of mouth buzz. And that made him, I think, more intriguing to me than if I had read about him somewhere and there had been a lot of information. I mean, there were other guitarists around that time who I really loved, Baden Powell and John Renbourn, two of my favorite guitarists. I never had much interest in their lives, though, the details of their lives. I wanted to know maybe how they got to be so good on their instruments. But with Lenny, I became interested in every detail of his life. And it wasn't to write a biography initially. That happened, 25 years later. But it's almost as though he was this mythological Canadian character. And I think that really hyped me up to, over time, to want to fill in all these blanks and really get to know this person who I'd heard about, but there seemed to be nothing until Emily Hughes' movie in 1999. There really wasn't much to go on, and it was seeing that movie that tipped me to write the biography.
Yeah, that would. I think I had originally thought of that too. I had played fingerstyle guitar from knowing Chet Atkins when I was very young. Chet Atkins was my first hero. And then I kind of eschewed the thumb pick for the flat pick and got into playing more bluegrass type of things, and then eventually into blues and rock and roll. And I mean, I started gigging when I was 12 years old.
Really?
So there was a lot of things that were similar to my story to Lenny, except that Lenny went on to completely revolutionize the way to play guitar, where that's not me. But Chet Atkins was
that yet.
Chet Atkins was his first guitar hero as well, and began playing country professionally at a young age, and I country and was the first thing that I started playing. Right. Before I moved to Toronto to study jazz. And how I ended up studying jazz, as I've probably told this story on other interviews before, but was an interview in Guitar Player magazine of Eddie Van Halen, who also was another hero of mine. And he was talking about Alan Holdsworth.
Right.
And if Eddie Van Halen's says that Alan Holdsworth is the best thing since sliced bread, well, then I better check it out. So I remember getting some recordings, and when I got to go to school to figure this out, because there's a lot more to learn about music.
Sure.
So that's how I ended up going to Humber College and then meeting Peter Harris, and that's where he would talk about Lenny as well. But at the time, I wasn't interested in Lenny, just whatever. But the seeds were planted. And then when Emily's movie came out and I watched that, I was like, I have to break out the thumb pick again and learn how to do what he's doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that was a wonderful movie. And it answered a lot of questions for me, but it also posed a lot of questions. I wanted to know more details. And really, about a month after I saw that movie, I decided that I was going to do the book. Earlier, I had thought about writing a novel using a character like Lenny as the lead character. And I think I made some attempts at that, and it just, but truth is stranger than fiction anyway. I mean, maybe can't really improve on Lenny's story.
Yeah. Well, And I think going back to Emily's documentary, I think that's what a good documentary should do. It should leave you with some questions. And so I think she did a really good job
Yes.
at when the movie ends, is you want to know more.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think if it wasn't for her movie, it's amazing how many people you find around the world now that know about Lenny and consider him an influence, where even me at the time, there's like this Lenny Breau shrine and little things, little pockets here and there, but information was still not that much to be found other than just listening to his recordings.
That's right.
So I think between you and Emily, you probably have done the most amount of work that way.
When I first went to the New England Conservatory, it was 1982, and I was in the jazz program there. There was not one guitar player in the jazz program who had heard of Lenny.
Mm.
Yeah, except the guitar instructor there, who was Mick Goodrick, who was a big fan of Lenny's, of course.
Right.
But yeah, nobody had heard of him, and a couple of years later, Lenny died, and that was some news in the area. And really, that was the first time these guys had heard of Lenny Breau. So I was constantly lending out that album to people, saying, "Man, you got to listen to this."
Yeah.
But it was a different time, and the guitar players who were influential then were, John Scofield and people like that. So,
right. Yeah. So, how was New England?
It was good. I mean, it was a great experience. I went there quite late. I was in my later 20s when I went there to get my undergrad degree, and wasn't really a thorough jazz guitar player.
Right.
I managed to get into the jazz program, and I stayed in it for 2 years, but it taught me that I wasn't really a jazz player, and I wasn't going to be. So I transferred to the classical department and graduated with a degree in classical guitar performance. But
yeah, I was wondering about that, because when you said jazz, I was like, oh, really? Okay. Because I thought for sure it was probably classical all along. That would have been my guess, but
right. Well, no. Originally, I was a fingerstyle player, and I played, this and that, whatever I could that could be fit on in fingerstyle, instrumental stuff, and that included some classical things. But I also liked to do arrangements of jazz standards, and it didn't really have any room for improvisation in it. But I always loved jazz harmony. And I love the way under Lenny's influence. I just love the way it worked on fretboard, and I always found that to be a lot of fun. And I learned the essentials of improvisation more on paper, and I knew modes and scales and all that sort of thing.
Right.
But I don't think I ever quite had the right mindset to be a jazz player. I'm a bit of an overthinker. So, and I think that interfered with a little bit.
Thinking is the enemy of improvisation.
Yeah, it baffles me, man.
Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about, like, what was it like? Did you end up studying with Mick Goodrick
I did
all,
for 2 years. Yeah.
How was that? You must have learned a lot.
Well, the thing about Mick was that you really had to know how to prime him to get stuff out of him. He had a vast knowledge of guitar and harmony. I mean, really just astonishing. I mean, he would show me things that he was working on that were mind-boggling, really. But he was a bit loath to impart that stuff. What he liked to do was to coach people who had a very definite direction in what they were doing. And when I went there, I wasn't really advanced enough for that. I was still struggling with a lot of basic things about jazz guitar. And I hadn't taken lessons. I took some classical lessons early on. but what I'd done with jazz guitar was mainly sitting down with records and reading theory books and that sort of thing. So yeah, it didn't quite work out with Mick. I had huge respect for him, but it just, and there was, I insisted on playing a nylon string guitar, and there was a lot of resistance in the jazz department, particularly from the head of the jazz department at the time, who was a bit old-fashioned about things like that, and
Right.
felt I should be playing like a hollow body, and so eventually it just seemed like the right thing to do. But it was valuable. It was valuable.
I've heard stories, from people that took lessons with him at Berkeley, where he could be quite cantankerous and make like make you cry. Like, when are you going to learn this shit? Kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, he had a very, very powerful work ethic.
Mm-hmm.
And if he felt that you weren't putting in the work, he would just, he could be quite cantankerous.
Right.
He once said that he thought that his duty as a teacher was to try to make people give it up. It was sort of like a boot camp. If you can hang in, so there's a bit of a contest going on there.
Yeah, maybe he would have made a great Marine drill sergeant.
That's right.
That's right. Yeah. Because their whole job is to ruin you, to make you nothing and build you back up to the way they want you.
But I have huge admiration and respect for the guy. I saw him play in many bands there in bars and clubs in Boston, and he was always just shining.
Right.
Really an amazing player.
I know that New England was known or is known, but maybe not at the time for that, or well, it should have been at the time, for that the third stream as it's known. Did you ever get any influence by that, or?
Well, it's interesting you would bring that up, because that was the reason I wanted to go to the New England Conservatory. I didn't really see myself as a jazz player or a classical player, but at that time, there wasn't anywhere you could go if you were a fingerstyle player. I mean, even the jazz thing was fairly new at that time, I think. Right. So I had wanted to get into the third stream thing, but they it just didn't work out. It didn't work out. The whole third stream thing there was based on this idea about learning music entirely by ear, sitting down and learning Charlie Parker solo by ear. I mean, there were people in the third stream program who were into all kinds of things, like there was a woman into ragtime piano, another guy who was a blues player. And so, yeah, the whole thing was a completely oral experience. You learn from sitting down and listening to something. So I would be in classes with these people, and there'd be classical people and so on. You could always tell the third string people there, because they would know immediately what a professor was playing on piano, could almost speak it back to them. It was quite remarkable. But in the end, I decided that really wasn't what I wanted to do. I really wanted to learn jazz harmony. That was the big thing. And so I auditioned as a jazz player. Yeah.
Well, you certainly would have learned a lot from Mick for sure then,
yeah.
So the very fortuitous thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Ron, thank you so much for doing this interview.
Great, it was a pleasure. I loved it. Yeah.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
Yeah, it was good.